What is up, night crawlers? Welcome back to the Nightmare's Edge. So this week I have a story called Double-Sided Justice. It is written by Radar Deboard. Please be sure to check the description for socials and for his book. Now, without any further ado, please sit back, relax, and let me tickle those inner fears. The first time Charlotte had done it, it was simply for survival. The club's lights and music had been enough for the night, so she had begun to stumble down the back alleyway to her home, to a simple apartment complex only a few blocks from there. She didn't notice him at first. Her mind was still floating in a slight sense of euphoria. Somehow, she had managed to find the perfect level of intoxication, just enough to feel a sense of invincibility, but not enough to be puking into a toilet later on. She didn't see him stalk her from across the street as she exited the club, and she certainly didn't notice him for the first few minutes of walking. It wasn't until he had grown within a few feet of her that she realized something was wrong. All the city men seemed to be the same to her, always feeling they were entitled to some action, regardless of how the woman felt about it. She had started walking a little faster, hoping he would give up from that alone. Instead, he quickened his pace, saying, "What's your hurry?" She had a small twinge of fear in her voice when she replied, "I have to get home." He grabbed her arm, causing her to stop in her tracks. "Come on, let's have some fun." She tried to push away from him, but he pushed her back, forcing her against the alley wall. His movements gave away the fact that he had probably done this at least a few times before. Charlotte was always prepared for this. Her years on a farm had taught her how to handle things herself. She knew how to defend herself and always had something to defend herself with. That's why she had a small knife tucked inside her bra. He probably never had a girl fight back. He was taken aback when she pulled the knife out and slashed it across his cheek. This caused him to stumble back for a split second. His immediate response was to fly into a rage and try to attack her. Lunging toward her with the intention of wrapping his arms around her throat, his fingers found a hold around Charlotte's neck as her blade penetrated his lower abdomen. His gasp of pain had sent a rush of adrenaline through her. His grip on her neck had tightened, causing a cutoff of air to her lungs. Her hand moved in quick succession, drawing the blade out and then back into his stomach. She continued to stab even after his grip had loosened. After the 15th or so stab, it was clear that that man would die in that alleyway, but she continued to drive the blade in and out of him. It was only after she had seen all life drain from his eyes that she finally stopped, letting his body fall over. She stood over the fresh corpse, taking in long, deep breaths. A sense of empowerment washed over her. This man had tried to take something from her, and she had stopped him from doing so. Now, other women would not fall victim to this animal's lust. In her eyes, she had done what was right by fighting off an attacker. Though, as this sense of empowerment began to fade, it was replaced by a sense of panic. What was she to do now? She had to call the cops. Tell them what had went down, let them know what had happened. Then she thought, what if they don't believe her? What if she ended up in jail because of this? An inner voice inside her head whispered, "Get rid of the body." Her inner monologue swayed her towards the idea of disposing of the body of her attacker. She had convinced herself that the police would never understand. She managed to drag the body to a dumpster several feet away and stashed it inside. Her inner voice told her she would have to go to her apartment first to get the necessary tools. Charlotte snuck carefully through the alleyway, making sure not to be spotted in blood-soaked clothes. She had made it back into her apartment without being spotted, rinsing the blood off her hands and changing into new clothes. Still listening to her inner voice, she grabbed her small toolbox, along with several larger knives from the kitchen, carefully making her way back to the scene of the crime. It took her a large amount of effort to get the body back out of the dumpster. 13 pieces, she thought to herself. I need to cut it into 13 pieces. It'll be much easier to hide. The rest of the night was spent knelt over the body, hacking, breaking, and stabbing it. She didn't have a saw to make cutting through the limbs easier, so she had to use a combination of a hammer and various knives. After several hours of work, she finally had the body separated into 13 different parts. "I have to throw the head into the river. The head is the most important part." She proceeded to gather up the body parts and move them back to her apartment. Over the next few days, she disposed of the body in different areas of the town, all wrapped up in newspaper to somewhat hide them. Of course, she made sure to throw the head into the river. Over the next few weeks, Charlotte continued on with her life, living as if the event hadn't happened, though the memory of it still lingered fresh in her mind. A sense of empowerment and ecstasy sweeping through her every time she replayed stabbing the man. It was roughly a month after she had killed him that her inner voice told her to do it again. She rejected the idea at first, but as the week went by, it grew on her. If there were more men, more rapists lurking the streets, shouldn't someone stop them? If not her, then who? By that Friday, she had already put together her plan. She had picked a club, chosen her weapon, and found a perfect kill location. That night, she implemented her plan, entering her club of choice as anyone else would. She made sure to dress promiscuously as possible and tried to put as much sexuality into her movements as possible. Then, she left the club late into the night, but well enough before final call. Sure enough, someone had followed her down the back way she was going. This time, it was easier for her. The kill happened more naturally. The stranger didn't even have time to really react. The feeling of empowerment made each knife stab feel that much better for Charlotte. She had purchased a hacksaw a few days earlier, making the dismemberment of the body a much simpler task. Just as before, she divided the remains into 13 pieces, making sure to throw the head in the river. The whole time, she told herself she was doing something good. She felt deep inside that she was doing what was right. She truly felt this, with the third, the fourth, and even the fifth man, each one of them actively pursuing her with evil intent. Though as she continued with the sixth and seventh, it didn't quite feel the same. The sense of empowerment of her overpowering and killing man wasn't as strong, and there was a strange sense of uneasiness rising in her. It wasn't a fear of being caught, though. The cops had no real leads, and she had made sure to erase all evidence of her being connected to the murders. The sense of uneasiness came from Charlotte's inner voice when she killed the men. It seemed to be getting crueler, more vicious with each kill. It was more demanding now, wanting her to kill every week as opposed to every month or so. The worst part was that she couldn't fight off the urge to do it. As she was hacking apart the 10th body, for the first time she thought to herself, why was she cutting it into 13 pieces? The number 13 didn't have any significance to her, so why was she doing it? Her inner voice answered, "It must be done." And with that, she continued to hack the body apart. Yet, she felt as though something was growing inside of her with each kill. Something that wasn't a part of her, something dark and sinister. As she watched the life drain from the 12th man's eyes, she only felt dread. A sense that someone was watching her, something she hadn't worried about with the other kills. As she drifted off to sleep that night, her inner voice whispered, "One more." The next few days, Charlotte felt awful. She was breaking out into cold sweats constantly and almost always had a sense of nausea. All the while, her inner voice seemed to just repeat, "One more." When that Saturday night arrived, she finally felt her health return. She was ready, and the hunt was on. There was one man who continued to eye her throughout the night at the club. She could sense his desire for her, his lust. She knew he was a perverted creature, worthy of her justice. That is, until he got up and started to leave before her. I can't lose him, she thought to herself. She followed him out, moving behind him as he made his way down an empty alleyway. He turned over his shoulder to see her following him. "Can I help you?" he said as Charlotte pulled the knife from her bra. She charged him, slamming into him. "What the hell?" he shouted as he fell to the ground. Charlotte jumped on top of him, plunging the knife into his neck. The man let out gasping noises as the blood began to fill his throat. Charlotte stabbed him a few more times, knowing the first stab had already sealed his demise. The man didn't thrash much. He didn't even really try to fight back. He only was able to stare up at her as he gasped his last breaths. Pure confusion and pain filled his eyes as his final moment came. For the first time, Charlotte felt an actual sense of guilt over what she had done. This man didn't seem like the others. She was the one that attacked him, not the other way around. Panic began to fill her. She had killed an innocent man. At least with the others, she could morally justify it, but not with him. "Cut up the body," her inner voice said, interrupting her. She ignored it, beginning to back away from the body. "Dismember the body now," her inner voice screamed at her. It was loud enough that Charlotte thought for a second it had hurt her ears. Her body began moving to collect the tools that she needed for the task. But Charlotte didn't want to do this. It was as if she was taking a back seat in her mind. Just as the 12 before, she cut the body into 13 pieces. She stood over the wrapped pieces of flesh, taking in deep breaths. For some reason, she felt as though this time had taken much more energy out of her. Her muscles were aching, and she felt like she was on the cusp of exhaustion. She could barely pick up the body parts, almost dropping them while moving them to her car. "Get rid of it all now," the voice said. Charlotte knew that scattering the body all in one night would draw too much attention from the cops. She started to drive to her house, ignoring the voice. "Do it now." The voice came as a scream inside her head, sending a wave of pain through her temples. Just like before with the body, Charlotte's hands moved without Charlotte even realizing it. She seemed to be on autopilot as she hid the various parts as she had done before. Her body feeling worse the more pieces she disposed of. As she drove towards the river, she began to develop a slight headache. She held the head out in front of her, hesitating before finally dropping it. It landed in the water with a small splash before disappearing below the surface. At that moment, the pain increased rapidly. Charlotte grabbed the sides of her head, feeling as if her brain was trying to burst from her skull. Charlotte had never felt this amount of pain from her headache before. It was almost debilitating. She managed to force herself to her car, stuffing several ibuprofen into her mouth. With her head still emitting waves of pain, she managed to drive back to her apartment. She barely managed to shut the door before she collapsed onto her knees, the pain growing stronger. Through each new wave of anguish, she felt as though something was moving around inside her skull. The feeling moved down, seeming now to push against her left ear. Charlotte screamed in pain as something broke through her eardrum. She clutched her ear, feeling something begin to ooze out onto her fingers. She looked, expecting blood, but shrieked in horror to find a strange black liquid in her hands. The small amount of liquid fell off her hand to the floor, leaving not a single trace of it in her hands. The pain she had felt radiating throughout her head was now gone, replaced instead by the pain from her newly broken eardrum. Her intact ear began to hear a disgusting noise coming from the ground. Looking down, she saw the black liquid begin to bubble before her. The liquid began to grow in mass, growing now to the size of a football. She stood up, still clutching her left ear, trying to avoid the disgusting thing on the floor. As the size of the liquid continued to grow, there was a shape taking form in it. The beginnings of 2 arms and legs can now easily be seen, along with the human-shaped head. Charlotte continued to back up until her back hit the door to her apartment. The liquid now began to fall down the sides of the thing, revealing the horrifying features of it. The legs were bent at strange angles, while the arms stretched well below the creature's twisted knees. Its face seemed to be covered in burns on the right side, while jagged scars covered the left. Yet the worst part was the festering blisters that covered the skin of the thing. Charlotte could not comprehend what she was witnessing. She could only stand and watch in horror as it grew. Now the thing had grown large enough to tower at least a foot over Charlotte. It let out a low roar as it stretched out its grotesque limbs. The thing opened its eyes and looked down upon Charlotte, the one that had brought it to this plane of existence. Charlotte stood unable to move as the thing studied her. The thing was her, her inner voice now made of flesh and blood. She could see it now through the warped, disgusting mistakes of the beast. It was a copy of Charlotte, a truly ugly imagination. When she had killed the first man, Charlotte had woken the voice, something that had been hidden away for a long time. But with the first kill had been brought to the forefront of her mind. Charlotte made that voice all her own. She murdered and dismembered the men. She disposed of the parts in the correct ways. All the while, her inner voice grew more grotesque with each killing, till all the violence and anger spilled out from her into the world. The thing could kill on its own now, and it would do so. Not a single man in the city would be safe from the creature. Though there was one thing the creature had to do first. There couldn't be two Charlottes. Again, thank you everyone for being here tonight. I truly appreciate it. Radar, thank you so much for allowing me to read this story. It was a lot of fun to narrate. But until next time, remember, just because you couldn't see it doesn't mean it wasn't watching you.